The room fell into an almost suffocating silence. The weight of it was tangible, pressing against the chest of every single person in the audience. The only sound was the distant ticking of an old clock hanging on the far wall, counting down every precious second. At the center of the room, on an elevated stage under the harsh spotlight, sat the young pianist. His fingers hovered over the keys, a slight tremor running through his fingertips. His palms were slick with sweat, and yet, he didn't move. He couldn't. The challenge had begun. He was about to attempt the impossible, to face something no one had ever conquered, not in a single minute, not in 10, and certainly not in 1 hour. This was La Campanella, the world-renowned masterpiece by Franz Liszt. But it wasn't just a performance. This was a challenge designed to test more than just technical skill. This was a trial of the mind, a test of human endurance, and perhaps something even darker. The pianist, whose name was Noah, had been preparing for this day for months, practicing tirelessly, until his fingers bled and his mind felt like it was on the edge of madness. He knew this music by heart, but that didn't matter. In this moment, with the whole world watching, he was unsure of what would happen next. The first note resounded, echoing in the cavernous hall, filling every corner with its brilliance. It was perfect. A single note that seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with an energy he couldn't explain. Noah felt a shiver run down his spine. His eyes darted to the clock. 1 minute. Just 1 minute to play the first section. He'd practiced this opening for countless hours, but there was a difference between playing it alone in the privacy of his practice room and doing it under these conditions, with so much at stake. The rules of the challenge were simple but terrifying. Play the entire piece, 1 minute, 10 minutes, or an hour, and you would be hailed as a legend. But no one had ever done it. No one had ever finished all 3 variations of the challenge. Some had tried, but those who attempted it never returned the same. Some even disappeared. The whispers had reached Noah's ears, the strange rumors about those who had faced the challenge before him. One pianist had walked off stage, shaken, muttering about shadows following him home. Another had locked himself in his practice room for days, only to emerge with a look of pure fear in his eyes, refusing to ever touch a piano again. The stories were vague, but the message was clear: this challenge was not just about music. There was something else at play here. Something haunting. His mind raced as his fingers moved across the keys, each note flowing effortlessly from his hands. He was in the zone. But then, something strange began to happen. As his fingers danced across the piano, the notes started to change. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly. It was as though the music was no longer his own. As if the piano was guiding him, pushing him in a direction he hadn't planned. The melody, which had always been so familiar, now felt foreign. Noah's heart skipped a beat. His hands slowed, the tempo faltering. He glanced up again. 1 minute. He had to finish the first part in 1 minute, or he would fail. The audience seemed to be holding its collective breath. Everyone was watching, waiting for him to fail. And yet, there was something almost magnetic about the scene. Something unsettling. It was as though the room itself had drawn them into a shared consciousness, a collective fear that they could all feel but not quite explain. Noah tried to focus, but his thoughts were spiraling. The piano, the notes, the music, it wasn't his anymore. Something was taking over, something more powerful than his own skill. His fingers moved with a mind of their own, slipping into a rhythm that he hadn't intended. He was no longer controlling the music, it was controlling him. The room was beginning to distort. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the sound of the piano grew louder, more intense. The air was thick, suffocating. Noah's breath became shallow, his chest tight. Was it the pressure of the challenge? Was it his fear of failure? Or was it something else, something far darker, something he had not prepared for? He glanced at the clock again. 10 seconds. Just 10 seconds to finish the first part. The notes raced faster, almost faster than his fingers could keep up. His heart pounded against his chest, as if urging him to give in, to stop the madness. But there was no stopping it now. Not when he was so close. He couldn't back down. Not when the world was watching. The final note of the first section came crashing down like a thunderclap, ringing through the hall. Noah's fingers froze. His heart stopped. The room was still. He'd made it. For now. But the challenge had only just begun. As the audience erupted in applause, Noah couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle in the pit of his stomach. It was as though the applause was not for his skill, but for something else. Something waiting for him to make the next move. He quickly glanced around, his eyes scanning the faces of the crowd, but no one looked the same. It was as if they were all watching him through a different lens, as if they knew something he didn't. He had passed the first section, but at what cost? What had just happened to him? Was it just the pressure of the challenge? Or was there something far more sinister going on? The second section of the challenge was about to begin, 10 minutes. He had no idea what would happen in the next 10 minutes, but he was certain of one thing: he was not alone in that room anymore. There was something, or someone, watching him. Noah took a deep breath, his hands shaking as he prepared to continue. The music was waiting for him, but so was whatever it was that had followed him from the first note. The clock started ticking. 10 minutes. And the darkness was only just beginning to show its face. The applause thundered in Noah's ears, but it felt like a distant sound, muffled and far away. He sat frozen at the piano, fingers trembling, still lingering over the keys of La Campanella. The last note had sounded, but it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. His chest heaved with rapid breaths, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The first section of the challenge was over, but the music still haunted him. The clock was ticking down, the 10-minute segment of the challenge waiting for him to play, but Noah wasn't sure if he could move. He glanced at the audience, their faces blurred and indistinct in his peripheral vision. They were applauding, but there was something odd about their expressions. No one was smiling. Their eyes were wide, watching him with a kind of strange intensity that made his skin crawl. It was like they knew something he didn't. Or perhaps it was the music. No, it couldn't be. But the room felt too thick, too oppressive, like the air was charged with an energy he couldn't escape. Was it the pressure? Was it fear? Or was there something else, something darker, that he hadn't yet fully grasped? Noah turned his attention back to the piano. The piece was far from over, and it wasn't just the competition that pushed him forward, it was something much deeper. He had to finish this. He had to prove to himself that he wasn't afraid. That he could master it. But the music, it had begun to warp in his mind. He shook his head, trying to clear the fogginess that seemed to cloud his thoughts. The second section of the challenge loomed before him, 10 minutes of the most intricate and challenging piece he had ever encountered. La Campanella was not a composition that could be easily mastered, and certainly not in a competitive setting like this. The piano keys seemed to shimmer under the harsh lights as he stared at them, as if they were beckoning him to dive back into the chaos that awaited. His fingers twitched involuntarily, betraying his nerves. But he couldn't stop. With a sharp exhale, Noah placed his hands back on the keyboard. The room fell silent once more, the audience watching intently, waiting for him to continue. He had no choice now. This wasn't just about music anymore, it was about survival. His heart pounded, but his mind felt strangely detached, as if he were watching himself from a distance. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, and then his fingers moved to the keys. The second part began with the first few notes, and immediately something felt wrong. The sound that emanated from the piano was not what he expected. It was flat, dissonant, off-key. His hands jerked back from the keys, and he quickly checked the position of his fingers, but nothing had changed. The keys were in their rightful place. Yet the notes they produced felt wrong, as if the piano had turned against him. Noah's heart raced again. He tried to play the opening bars again, but this time the music came out wrong. It was not the familiar melody he had practiced for countless hours, not the one he had perfected during sleepless nights. It sounded almost distorted, as though the music was alive, twisting and warping with a mind of its own. He stopped. The audience shifted in their seats, murmurs running through the room. They had heard it too. But Noah couldn't figure it out. What was happening to the music? His eyes darted to the clock, watching the seconds tick away. 10 minutes. He had 10 minutes to finish this section, but with every passing second, his sense of reality seemed to slip further and further away. The challenge was turning into a nightmare. A sudden chill swept over him, and he shuddered involuntarily. Something was off, something far beyond the usual pressure of the competition. The piano had changed. The sound had changed. The atmosphere had changed. It felt as though the very room itself had shifted, the walls closing in, the lights dimming. Was this just his mind playing tricks on him? No, he could feel it. There was something darker at play, something he wasn't prepared for. Noah forced himself to play again. This time, the notes rang true, but they were harsher, more forceful than before. He continued to play, the melody echoing in the room, each note striking like a hammer against his senses. He could feel the rhythm of his heartbeat thumping in time with the music, and as he played, he became more aware of a presence, a shadow lurking just beyond his line of sight. Noah tried to ignore it, to focus on the music. But with each passing second, the presence grew stronger, more defined. It was there, in the back of his mind, whispering just beneath the sound of the piano. He could almost hear its breath, feel its gaze upon him. Was he imagining it? Or was something watching him from the darkness? His mind was racing, but his hands moved mechanically, continuing to play the complicated piece as the clock ticked down. The audience was quiet now, their eyes locked on him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. He could feel their collective gaze on him, weighing him down. It wasn't just the music anymore, it was their expectation, their silent demand that he succeed. It was as though their very presence was part of the challenge. And then, just as Noah reached the middle of the piece, it happened again. The piano trembled beneath his fingers, and the music shifted once more, spiraling into a new direction. The notes began to blur together, and Noah's hands faltered. His body felt as though it were no longer his own, and the music seemed to take control, forcing him to play. Faster, harder, more recklessly. He tried to stop. He couldn't. His fingers refused to obey. The sound grew louder, more chaotic, until the melody became a cacophony of distorted notes, a screeching, tearing sound that reverberated in his skull. His heart raced. The darkness that had been lurking just at the edges of his mind now overtook him, drowning him in its presence. He could feel the weight of it pressing against him, suffocating him, as though something was pushing him deeper into the madness. A loud crash echoed through the room as the piano seemed to explode with sound, but Noah didn't stop playing. He couldn't. His fingers moved with frantic speed, desperately trying to keep up with the tempo that had spiraled out of control. His eyes darted to the clock again. The time was slipping away, but the music refused to slow down. It was no longer his to control. The room was spinning now. The audience had disappeared, or perhaps they had never been there at all. Noah's vision blurred, and the shadows in the corners of the room stretched long and dark, their forms twisting in unnatural ways. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows that danced on the walls. The air felt thick, as though it were suffused with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. And then, just as he felt he might lose himself completely, the music stopped. Noah's hands jerked away from the keys, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence in the room was deafening. The challenge wasn't over. It was just beginning. The clock had stopped. For a moment, Noah was paralyzed, unable to move. His mind was a blur, and his body felt as though it had been drained of all energy. The audience, now silent, stared at him with wide eyes. He had made it. For now. But he had no idea what lay ahead. The clock had stopped, but Noah's battle was far from over. Noah could feel the sweat trickling down his neck, soaking the back of his shirt. His breath was shallow, every inhalation a laborious effort, his chest rising and falling in time with the frantic beat of his heart. The music had stopped, but the echoes of it lingered in the room, vibrating in his skull, pressing against his temples. His fingers still ached, a dull throb that seemed to radiate through his hands and up his arms. It wasn't just the exhaustion of playing the piano for so long. It was something deeper, something far more unsettling. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there, frozen in place. The audience was silent, watching him with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. Noah's eyes flicked to the clock. The seconds had stopped ticking, leaving him in a kind of suspended animation. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the truth. The clock was broken. It wasn't a mechanical failure. No, this was something else. The clock had stopped, not because it had malfunctioned, but because it no longer mattered. In this strange, twisted space he had found himself in, time was no longer an absolute. He had been trapped in the music, in the challenge. And now, the very essence of reality seemed to have unraveled. The audience had begun murmuring again, their soft voices carrying an edge of nervousness. Their eyes were wide, but not with wonder or admiration. No, there was something darker in their gaze. Something more primal. They were afraid. Fear hung in the air like a thick fog, and Noah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something that wasn't human. It was as though the very walls of the room had grown eyes, observing him, waiting. Noah forced himself to move, his legs feeling like lead as he slowly stood up. The room seemed to tilt, the floor shifting beneath him. The piano, once his trusted instrument, now felt like a foreign object, its keys taunting him, its presence a reminder of the challenge he was now trapped in. He looked around, desperate for something, anything, that could anchor him back to reality. His eyes landed on the crowd. They were still staring at him, their expressions a mixture of fear and curiosity. But there was something more. There was something in the way they looked at him that unsettled him even further. They weren't just spectators, they were participants. They were part of this, part of the dark force that had taken hold of the challenge. "Why are you staring at me?" Noah's voice was barely a whisper, but the words seemed to hang in the air like a shout. He didn't expect an answer, but the silence was suffocating. He turned back to the piano, his fingers instinctively moving toward the keys. He knew what came next. The next part of the challenge, the one that had never been conquered, was waiting for him. The 1-hour section. Noah had practiced for this moment. He had rehearsed the piece over and over again, memorized every note, every shift in the tempo. But now, it seemed impossible. The music was no longer the same. The notes that he had once known so well now seemed distant, foreign. They no longer made sense. He couldn't focus. His hands shook uncontrollably as they hovered over the keys, unable to play. There was something else. Something wrong. His gaze flickered to the sheet music in front of him. The notes were there, but they had changed. The familiar symbols that had once flowed easily from his mind to his fingers now looked like jumbled, nonsensical scribbles. His eyes darted across the page, trying to make sense of it, but the more he looked, the more distorted it became. The notes seemed to shift before his very eyes, rearranging themselves in an endless loop. The audience was still watching him, their gaze unblinking, but Noah couldn't bring himself to care. He was trapped in the music, trapped in the chaos that had been unleashed the moment he had accepted the challenge. There was no escape. There was no way out. And then, it happened. A single, clear note rang out. It was perfect. It was the note he had been searching for, the note that would anchor him back to the music. But as soon as it sounded, the air in the room changed. The temperature dropped, the light flickered, and a cold, invisible presence seemed to sweep through the hall. Noah froze. The sound of the note reverberated through his bones, vibrating in his chest, but it wasn't just the music. It was a message. A warning. His breath caught in his throat as the piano keys shifted beneath his fingers. He pulled his hands away, but they wouldn't listen. The piano was playing by itself now. The keys moved on their own, the notes swirling into a chaotic symphony that Noah could not control. He watched in horror as the piano seemingly came alive, the melody twisting and turning with an eerie, unnatural force. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of dissonant notes that felt like they were tearing through his mind. Noah covered his ears, but the music still flooded his senses. It was everywhere. It was inside him, around him, beneath him. The walls seemed to pulse with the rhythm, the floor vibrating with the force of the sound. He could feel his grip on reality slipping. The world around him began to distort, the once solid structure of the room warping as though it were a mirage. The floor began to crack beneath his feet, and the audience's faces blurred, their features melting together, becoming one indistinct mass. No! Stop! Noah screamed, his voice hoarse, but it was as though the words didn't exist. The sound of the piano drowned them out. The keys continued to play, the notes spinning faster, louder, more relentless. And then, amidst the madness, he saw it. A shadow. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker in the corner of his vision. But then it grew, becoming more solid, more real. A figure. A shape. Tall and dark, with features that were obscured by the distorted light. Noah couldn't tell if it was a person or something else entirely. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, flowing with the rhythm of the music, bending and twisting with every note. The figure was coming closer. Noah's pulse raced, his body trembling as the shadow advanced. It was almost like it was moving to the music, following the twisted rhythm of the piano. Noah wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. His feet were glued to the floor, and his hands were still hovering over the keys, forced to play the notes that were coming faster, faster, faster. And then the figure was right in front of him. It was standing at the edge of the stage, its face obscured in darkness, but Noah could feel its presence. It was cold, like the void itself, and the air around it seemed to freeze. The music stopped. The shadow faded. Noah's breath caught in his throat. The audience remained silent, as if they had not witnessed anything out of the ordinary. But Noah could feel it, something had changed. He wasn't alone. He had never been alone. With a trembling hand, he reached for the piano again. This time, he could feel the keys vibrating beneath his fingertips, as if they were alive, responding to his touch. He had to finish. He had to complete the challenge. But at what cost? The shadow was gone, but the presence still lingered. The music was no longer his to control. The notes were speaking to him, telling him to play, but they weren't his thoughts. The piano was guiding him now. Noah's fingers moved of their own accord, dancing across the keys as the melody began again. It was no longer La Campanella. It was something else entirely. Something darker. And as he played, he could feel the presence of the shadow in the music, guiding him, pushing him further into the unknown. The clock had started again. 1 hour. But as Noah played, he realized the true cost of the challenge. It was no longer about mastering the music. It was about surviving it. And as the hours ticked away, Noah knew one thing for certain: he was no longer in control. The room had become a labyrinth of noise and silence, light and shadow. Noah's fingers continued to strike the keys, his mind barely connected to the world around him. The melody, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a foreign language, something ancient and incomprehensible. It was as though the music itself was alive, an entity that was slowly consuming him, pulling him deeper into a world he could not escape. His body was a machine, moving automatically, each note following the next, but his mind was elsewhere. It was like he was caught in a trance, an unstoppable force that he could neither resist nor understand. The shadow had vanished, but the chill it left behind had not. It clung to him like a second skin, a constant reminder that something was watching, something was waiting. Noah's breath was coming in short, shallow bursts, but he kept playing. The audience was still there, but they had become indistinct shapes, figures blurring into one another, their faces warped by the darkness in the room. He could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their stares pressing down on him, urging him to continue. But he wasn't sure if they were real anymore. Were they? Were they part of the challenge, or were they just figments of his deteriorating mind? The piano was his only anchor. It was the only thing that kept him grounded, or so he thought. But as his fingers moved across the keys, the room began to shift again. The walls seemed to bend, warping like a mirage. The light flickered, casting long shadows that crawled across the floor, stretching like fingers reaching for him. His hands grew heavier, his movements more sluggish. He could feel the music pulling him into the void, each note like a chain that bound him to something dark and ancient. He had to finish. He had to complete the challenge. But as he played, something inside him began to unravel. His thoughts became disjointed, the music. A blur of sound and color that seemed to swirl around him, suffocating him. Noah's mind flashed back to the first time he had sat down at the piano, years ago. He had always loved music, always been drawn to its power to transcend boundaries, to communicate emotions without words. But now, as his fingers continued to move, he felt that connection slipping away. The music was no longer his own. It was no longer about expression or beauty. It was about survival. The notes were no longer notes, they were commands, forces that dictated his every move. He tried to stop. He tried to pull his hands away from the keys, but they wouldn't move. They were locked in place, the piano now in control. The once beautiful melody had become a monster, an entity that held him captive. The notes twisted and turned, rising to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. Noah felt the pressure building in his chest, his heart pounding as if it would burst. The piano was becoming louder, more insistent, and he could feel the music seeping into his bones, filling his veins with an icy dread. It wasn't just a song, it was a curse. The audience, if they could still be called that, had stopped moving. They were watching, but they were no longer human to him. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, their expressions frozen in time. Noah could see the fear in their eyes, and it mirrored his own. They were trapped, just like him. He had to finish. He had to get through the challenge. But as the music grew louder, the room seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls stretched out of proportion, the ceiling rising high above him, an endless abyss that seemed to swallow the light. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the very space around him was becoming distorted, twisted by the force of the piano. And then it happened again. A voice. It wasn't a whisper, but a presence, an entity that spoke without words, its voice inside his head, vibrating against his skull. It was cold, distant, like the wind blowing through the empty halls of an ancient, forgotten temple. Finish it. You must finish. The words rang through Noah's mind, louder than the music itself, filling his ears with an unbearable pressure. His fingers moved faster, more recklessly, as though the music was guiding him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. He couldn't think anymore. He couldn't process what was happening. His thoughts were lost in the music, lost in the void that had swallowed him whole. He glanced up at the clock. It was still there, ticking away, but the hands were moving in reverse, as though time itself was breaking down. It didn't matter anymore. The challenge had ceased to be about time. It was about something else, something he couldn't understand. The music was taking over. It was no longer a melody. It was an entity. It was alive, and it was speaking to him. Noah felt his breath catch in his throat as the shadow returned. This time, it wasn't a flicker in the corner of his eye. It was solid, standing at the edge of the stage, its form towering over him, blocking out the light. It was impossible to see its face, but he could feel its eyes upon him, boring into his soul. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but he had no choice. The shadow had returned, and it wasn't leaving. It was watching him, waiting for him to complete the challenge. The presence in his mind grew stronger, louder, urging him to finish. The music was reaching its peak. The notes were no longer even recognizable. They were disjointed, chaotic, as if the piano itself were rebelling against the very laws of music. Each note struck like a hammer, echoing in his skull, drowning out everything else. His mind was a blur, his body no longer responding to his commands. His hands moved, but they weren't his anymore. The shadow loomed larger. It was closer now, so close he could feel its presence, cold and suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. His heart was racing. The music was no longer just sound, it was a living, breathing thing, and it was controlling him. "Stop," Noah whispered, but his voice was lost in the music. The shadow was closing in, and he could feel it tugging at his soul, pulling him deeper into the abyss. He was losing himself. The piano was no longer something he could control. It was something that controlled him. The challenge wasn't just a test of skill anymore. It was a test of his very existence. The room was spinning. The music was a blur, a whirlwind of sound that threatened to consume him. His hands moved without his will, the notes now foreign and dissonant, ripping through his mind like jagged shards of glass. He could feel his consciousness slipping away. He couldn't hold on much longer. And then, the room stopped. The music stopped. The shadow was gone. Noah's hands fell limp at his sides, and he slumped forward, his chest heaving with the effort to breathe. The silence was deafening, but it was a welcome sound. The overwhelming pressure had finally lifted. He was still alive. He had finished. The clock had stopped. The challenge was over. But Noah didn't feel victorious. He felt empty. Hollow. The audience remained silent, their faces still frozen in time. No one moved. It was as though they had all been waiting for him to finish, waiting for him to be consumed by the music. But now that it was over, they were nothing more than shadows, just like the presence that had haunted him throughout the challenge. Noah looked around the room, his vision blurry, his body trembling. He had made it. But at what cost? He had played the piano, and in doing so, he had allowed the music to take control. He had faced something that no one had ever dared to confront. And now, he wasn't sure if he had won or lost. The challenge had consumed him, mind and soul, and he wasn't sure if he could ever escape it. As the silence stretched on, Noah knew that this was only the beginning. The piano, the music, the shadow, they were all still with him. They had marked him. And they wouldn't let go. The clock had stopped. But Noah's journey was far from over. The silence that followed the final note was deafening. Noah's heart raced in his chest, each beat reverberating through his body, but the music, the energy, the force that had driven him, had finally dissipated. The air in the room was thick with tension, heavy with something else, something Noah couldn't quite grasp. The piano was still, its keys unmoving, as if it were waiting for him to make a decision. He had completed the challenge. That was the only thought left in his mind, the only certainty. But it felt hollow. He should have felt victorious, proud even, but all Noah could feel was a gnawing emptiness inside of him, a sense of dread that coiled deep within his stomach. It was as if the music, the shadow, the challenge, had taken something from him, something that couldn't be replaced. Something he couldn't even name. His fingers still tingled from the sensation of playing, but it wasn't just the physical memory of the keys. It was something more insidious. It was like the music had left an imprint on him, a mark that was slowly becoming part of his very being. Every note, every chord, seemed to echo in his mind, relentlessly, and even though he had stopped playing, the music hadn't stopped. It continued to pulse in his thoughts, an incessant hum that filled his head. He blinked, trying to clear his mind, but it was as though his senses were clouded. The edges of the room seemed to blur, the walls distorting, as though they were slowly closing in on him. He looked down at his hands, still resting on the piano, but now, instead of the familiar ivory keys, they seemed to be sinking into the blackness of the instrument. It was as if the piano itself was absorbing him, pulling him into it, its depths calling to him, and Noah couldn't pull away. He yanked his hands back, but the sensation didn't fade. It lingered, lingering like the aftertaste of a nightmare that wouldn't let go. His breath was shallow, the room beginning to feel stifling, as though the air was thick with something heavy, something not meant to be. The audience, still eerily silent, had become nothing more than shadows, their faces blurred into the background, their expressions unreadable. He had been playing for them, for the challenge, but now they no longer mattered. They had become part of the distortion, part of the puzzle he was slowly losing himself in. Noah felt dizzy. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer alone. It was there again, that same presence that had haunted him since the moment he sat down to play. It had been watching him throughout the challenge, lingering just beyond the edges of his consciousness, and now it was stronger, more tangible. He could feel it pressing against him, pushing him further into a world he didn't understand. It was suffocating, choking the life out of him. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't move. A low, rumbling sound filled the room, not from the piano this time, but from the very walls themselves. The air grew colder, and Noah could see his breath mist in front of him. His chest tightened as if an invisible hand had wrapped around his ribs, squeezing. His vision blurred again, and he fought to stay upright, but the weight of it all was unbearable. The floor seemed to tilt beneath him, and he staggered, barely keeping his balance. His mind was spinning. It wasn't just the music anymore. It wasn't just the challenge. There was something more. Something darker. And then, as though the room itself had heard his thoughts, the shadow appeared again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a figure standing at the edge of the stage anymore. This time, it was everywhere. It filled the room, its presence suffocating, tangible. The darkness pooled in the corners, creeping up the walls, swirling around him like smoke. Noah took a step back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He couldn't see its face, couldn't discern any features, but he felt it. It was staring at him, watching him, waiting for him to do something, anything. He didn't know what it wanted, but he knew one thing for certain: it wasn't going to leave until it had claimed him completely. The room seemed to pulse with an eerie rhythm, as though it were beating in time with the music that still filled his mind. Every beat of his heart felt synchronized with the darkness, and Noah could hear a low, guttural hum beneath the sound of his breath. It was a voice, though not spoken in any language he knew. It was a vibration, a resonance that sank deep into his bones, urging him to continue, to finish the challenge that had begun so long ago. "Stop," Noah whispered, his voice hoarse, barely audible against the relentless hum. His body was trembling, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Please, stop." But the shadow didn't respond. It didn't need to. It was everywhere, inside him, around him, controlling him. He could feel its icy fingers wrap around his mind, pulling him deeper, dragging him into the abyss. And then, it spoke. It wasn't a voice like the ones he had heard before, but a feeling, a presence that vibrated through his skull. The music, the notes, the piano, it was all connected. It was all part of a single entity, a force that had been feeding on his energy, his fear, his very soul since he had started the challenge. And now, it was asking for something more. "You are mine now, Noah." The words echoed in his mind, the voice deep and ancient, like the wind whispering through the cracks of an abandoned building. The very walls of the room seemed to tremble at the sound of it. It was all-consuming, filling his senses, drowning him in its weight. The piano, the music, the shadow, it was all part of this dark force, and it wasn't going to let him go. Noah staggered backward, the sensation of the room warping intensifying. His vision was beginning to cloud over, the edges of the world blurring. He could no longer tell where the music ended and where the shadows began. Everything was merging into one, a never-ending cycle of sound and darkness that he couldn't escape. He tried to fight it, tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the floor. His breath was shallow, his chest tightening as the force pressed in on him, choking him, suffocating him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, raw from the effort, but it didn't matter. The shadow was there, pressing down on him, drowning him in its presence. And then, in the midst of the suffocating darkness, he saw something. A flash of light, a single point of brightness in the sea of shadows. It was distant, almost impossible to reach, but Noah's gaze locked onto it. It was his only hope. It was the only thing that seemed to offer him any chance of escape. With a strength he didn't know he had left, Noah pushed himself up, his fingers scraping against the floor as he reached for the light. His body was shaking, his mind was clouded, but he couldn't stop now. He had to reach it. He had to find a way out of this nightmare. His fingers brushed the edge of the light, and in that moment, everything stopped. The darkness receded, the music fell silent, and for a brief, precious second, Noah felt something akin to peace. It was fleeting, like the calm before the storm, but it was enough to make him believe that he could escape. That he could be free. But as quickly as it had come, the peace vanished. The light flickered, and the shadow surged back, stronger than before. It consumed him, filling his mind, his body, his very soul. And Noah realized, in that terrible moment, that there was no escape. He was part of it now. Forever. Noah's body was broken, his mind fractured. He could feel the relentless pulse of the shadow, an echo that reverberated in his chest and skull, resonating with every breath he took. The room, once solid and familiar, had long since become a place he no longer recognized. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the weight of the challenge itself had carved into the very fabric of his reality. Every corner of the room stretched outward, disorienting him, making him feel as though he were Falmerage, a trick of the mind, and the shadow that had followed him from the very first note of La Campanella had consumed him completely. The darkness had become part of him, and now there was no turning back. The piano, that once beautiful instrument that had been his sanctuary, now stood before him like a monstrous entity. The keys, still glistening under the dim lights, seemed to mock him. They were no longer just keys. They were the teeth of a predator, waiting to consume him completely. Noah had no choice but to face it. He had no choice but to finish what he had started. But as he moved toward the piano, something changed. The music, which had once been his prison, now felt like a distant memory, something too far away to reach. The piano seemed to be waiting for him to make the first move, but Noah hesitated. What would happen if he played again? Would the darkness consume him entirely? Or would the music finally release him from its grasp? His fingers twitched, and for a brief, terrifying moment, he felt the pull of the piano, the force that had taken him over during the challenge. He could feel it urging him, coaxing him to play, but this time, he resisted. He stepped back, his feet heavy, as though the floor itself were pulling him toward the keys. His breath was ragged, but he refused to give in. The shadow lingered at the edges of his vision, a constant reminder that it was still there, watching, waiting. It was part of him now. But Noah knew that if he played again, if he allowed himself to give in to the music, there would be no escape. The darkness would claim him, mind, body, and soul. He took a deep breath and stepped away from the piano, his legs shaking as he moved toward the edge of the stage. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing against him, the shadows growing longer, more oppressive. He had to escape. He had to get out of this nightmare. But as he reached the edge of the stage, he stopped. He could hear it, the music. The faintest melody, like a whisper in the dark, threading its way into his mind. The shadow was no longer just an observer. It was alive, part of him, and it was pushing him back toward the piano. He could feel it, like a cold hand on his back, forcing him forward. Play, the voice inside his mind whispered, its tone cold, commanding. You must finish. Only then will you be free. Noah's heart hammered in his chest, but his body obeyed. His legs moved on their own, dragging him back toward the piano. He was no longer in control. The darkness had claimed him, and he was nothing more than a puppet, his strings pulled by forces beyond his comprehension. His hands fell to the keys, and the music started again. At first, it was faint, distant, like a ghostly echo of the piece he had played before. But as his fingers touched the keys, the music grew louder, more insistent, rising with an intensity that drowned out everything else. The notes became sharper, harsher, tearing at his mind with a relentless fury. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, the weight of the challenge, the weight of the music, pressing down on him, threatening to crush him under its power. And then, the shadow appeared once again. It wasn't just an ominous figure lurking in the corners of the room. It was there, in the center of the stage, standing in the very air he breathed. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. Noah's breath caught in his throat as it advanced toward him, its form flickering in and out of existence like a mirage. The darkness surrounded him, its tendrils wrapping around him like a vice, squeezing the life out of him. It spoke again. Finish the piece. Play the last note. Then you will be free. Noah's fingers moved involuntarily, the music taking control. The keys seemed to vibrate beneath his hands, each note heavier than the last. His mind was slipping, his thoughts dissolving into the music, but he couldn't stop. The shadow had taken over. There was no escape. The music, the darkness, it had all merged into one. His hands moved faster, the tempo increasing with every note. The pieces of La Campanella he had once known so well now felt like shards of glass, cutting through his mind, his soul. The pain was unbearable, but he couldn't stop. His body was no longer his own. The shadow had taken him. The final note was drawing closer, a sound that would mark the end of everything. But Noah wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Was he ready to finish the challenge? Was he ready to let the music consume him completely? The pressure in his chest reached its peak, and he could feel the darkness, the shadow, swallowing him whole. He had no choice now. He had to play the final note. But as he played, something shifted. The music was no longer just a symphony of chaos, it became a single, clear note, ringing through his head, vibrating in his bones. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. The music, the shadow, the room, they all disappeared. Noah was alone, floating in a vast, empty space. There was no light. There was no sound. Just silence. He couldn't feel the piano beneath his hands, couldn't hear the echo of the final note. He was suspended in nothingness, surrounded by an endless void. But in that silence, he found something. Peace. A stillness that washed over him, cleansing him of the darkness. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. The world returned. The music faded. The shadow vanished. Noah opened his eyes. He was still sitting at the piano. The room was still the same. The audience, if they had ever truly been there, was gone. There were no walls pressing in on him. No darkness. No shadow. Just silence. The challenge was over. But Noah felt something else. He felt different. Changed. The air around him seemed lighter, but but there was a strange sense of finality to the emptiness. The music had stopped, but its echo still lingered in his mind. He had completed the challenge. He had played the final note. But in doing so, he had paid a price. The room, once oppressive, now felt like a space he could breathe in. He could feel the weight of the challenge lift from his shoulders, the pressure that had held him captive for so long finally releasing. But the relief was bittersweet. The final note had been played, but the shadow, the darkness, it had left its mark on him. He wasn't sure if he could ever be the same again. As Noah stood up from the piano, he took a final look around the empty room. There was no applause, no fanfare. The challenge was over, but it had taken something from him that he couldn't get back. The door to the room was open now. It had been there the entire time, but he hadn't noticed it before. He walked toward it, his legs shaky, but he knew that beyond it lay the real world. A world he hadn't been part of for so long. He stepped through the door, and as he did, the last traces of the music faded away. The shadow, the force that had driven him, was gone. He was free. But as he walked away, a part of him knew that the challenge wasn't truly over. The music, the darkness, it had left a mark on him. And he would carry it with him, forever. The final note had been played. But Noah knew the music never truly ends. Noah has finally faced the challenge, completed the music, and walked away. However, the true cost of the challenge is clear. He is forever changed by the experience, carrying with him the echoes of the music and the shadow that haunted him. The ending leaves a haunting question: has Noah truly escaped, or is he forever bound to the music that once consumed him? The story concludes with a sense of finality, yet an eerie feeling that the music never truly ends.